He entered the hall with that gaze that always consumed me. The candles flickered as if they, too, felt his presence. My heart pounded against my chest as I clutched the medallion, the only proof of my true lineage. "Reveal her," he commanded, and all eyes turned to me. The silence weighed like lead. The truth, after years hidden in the shadows, would finally come to light. I felt my legs weaken. It was too late to flee my destiny, our destiny. Before we delve into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. On that cold autumn morning, I still didn't know that my life would change forever. The sun had barely risen when Mrs. Matilda yelled for me, as she always did. 15 years serving in that house, and she still treated me like an animal. "Elara, your coffee's getting cold. Come serve the master before he wakes up in a bad mood," she shouted from the kitchen as I finished sweeping the back patio. I hurried, feeling the cold stone beneath my bare feet. Thornwood Manor was imposing like a fortress with its thick walls and high windows that seemed to observe everything around. I knew every corner, every corridor, every sigh of that mansion where I grew up as a servant after my parents died in an epidemic that devastated the village when I was only 5 years old. Lord Augustus, the owner of the manor, had taken me in out of pity. Or at least that's what Mrs. Matilda, his wife, made sure to remind me daily. Eternal gratitude is what you owe this house girl. Nobody wanted the daughter of a washerwoman and a nameless blacksmith. That morning, as I served the strong, bitter coffee that the master liked, I noticed something different in the air. Lord Augustus seemed more tense than usual, his eyes fixed on the newspaper, his brow furrowed into deep wrinkles. Beside him, Cecilia, his only daughter and heir to the manor, barely touched her food. She was paler than normal, her slender fingers drumming nervously on the oak table. "He arrives today," Lord Augustus finally said, folding the newspaper with precision. "Duke Henry of Stonehaven is coming to see our lands." I felt Mrs. Matilda's gaze pierce my back. She always distrusted me, as if I could steal the family's secrets just by existing in the same space. "Elara," she called me with that voice that seemed to drag across the floor, "I want this house impeccable. The Duke is the most powerful man in this province. They say even the Emperor respects him. If Cecilia can impress him, well, our problems would be solved." I nodded in silence, already knowing what that meant. Thornwood Manor had been drowning in debt for years. Bad harvests, new competing farms, rising taxes, everything conspired against Lord Augustus. An advantageous marriage for Cecilia was the only salvation they saw. The day passed in a whirlwind. I cleaned, scrubbed, polished, organized. My hands were red and chapped when the sun began to set. It was then that I heard the horses whinny and the sound of wheels on the stone road. I ran to the window of the room I shared with 3 other maids and saw the most imposing carriage I had ever seen. It was black as night, pulled by 4 horses of the same color. It seemed to swallow the light around it. "Get away from the window, you foolish girl!" Mrs. Matilda suddenly appeared, pulling me by the arm. "Go to the kitchen and stay there. You are not to be seen, understand? The Duke does not appreciate people like you, people like me." Those words no longer hurt me as they once did. I knew what they meant. My dark skin, untamed curly hair and amber eyes, features that betrayed the mixed blood in my veins. Blood that, for families like Lord Augustus, was a source of shame. But I didn't obey Mrs. Matilda that night. Something stronger compelled me to see this Duke with my own eyes. I hid in the dark corridor leading to the main hall, where a small opening in the wall allowed me to observe without being seen. It was there that I saw him for the first time. He entered as if the world belonged to him. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black except for his impeccably starched white shirt. His black hair fell loose to his shoulders, contrasting with his fair skin. But it was his eyes that captivated me. Deep, dark, vigilant. They seemed to assess everything in seconds, like a predator calculating its next move. "Duke Henry of Stonehaven," announced the attendant who accompanied him. "Lord of lands beyond the eastern mountains and advisor to the Emperor." Lord Augustus bowed slightly, extending a trembling hand. Cecilia made a perfect curtsy, her face even paler under the visitor's penetrating gaze. Mrs. Matilda smiled with an enthusiasm she never showed on normal occasions. "It is an inestimable honour to receive your grace on our humble estate," Lord Augustus said, leading him to the main armchair. "Humble would not be the word I would use," the Duke replied, his grave, melodious voice echoing through the walls. "I have heard many stories about the legendary Thornwood Manor, about its beauty and its secrets." A heavy silence fell over the hall. For an instant, I had the impression that the Duke's eyes turned to my hiding place, as if he could feel my presence through the walls. A shiver ran down my spine and I instinctively recoiled. During dinner, I served the guests, keeping myself in the shadows, as Mrs. Matilda had instructed. But each time I approached the table to change a plate or serve wine, I felt the Duke's gaze following me. It wasn't a look of contempt like that of so many other nobles who had passed through that house. It was something different, more intense, as if he was trying to unravel an enigma. "They say this region was inhabited by ancient tribes before colonization," he commented, as he cut his meat with surgical precision. "Tribes that mastered secrets of the earth and the forest, that communicated with spirits and forces that we civilized men have forgotten." "Mere superstitions, Your Grace," Mrs. Matilda hastened to say. "Our people are devoted to the Holy Church. Such beliefs have no place among us. Is that so?" The Duke raised an eyebrow, and an enigmatic smile appeared on his lips. "Yet I heard that Thornwood Manor was built on sacred lands, that the old owner found peculiar artifacts. When digging the foundations," Lord Augustus choked on his wine. Cecilia dropped her fork, which clattered loudly against the porcelain plate. "Nonsense," Lord Augustus said, recovering. "Stories to scare children. What truly matters is the present, isn't it? And in the present, we have the pleasure of your company and the hope of establishing profitable ties." At that moment, as I served the Duke more wine, my hand trembled slightly, and a few drops fell onto the white tablecloth. Mrs. Matilda shot me a murderous look, but before she could reprimand me, the Duke raised his hand, a silent gesture that stopped her. "What is your name?" he asked me, looking directly into my eyes for the first time. "Ilara, Your Grace," I replied, lowering my gaze as protocol demanded. "Ilara," he repeated, as if savouring each syllable. "An uncommon name, of indigenous origin, if I'm not mistaken. It means she who comes from the earth, doesn't it?" I froze. No one had ever commented on my name, much less knew its meaning. Not even I. "The servant cannot answer complex questions, Your Grace," Mrs. Matilda intervened with a forced laugh. "She was raised out of charity after losing her parents. She barely knows how to read." The Duke's smile disappeared for an instant, replaced by something that looked like anger, indignation, but soon his expression returned to being impassive. "Interesting," he merely said, before turning his attention to Cecilia, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. "And you, young lady, do you appreciate the ancient stories of this region?" I prefer French novels, Your Grace," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "Of course," the Duke said, a slight tone of disappointment in his voice. "The French have always been masters at imagining worlds that don't exist." The rest of the dinner passed in a strange atmosphere. The Duke asked questions that seemed innocent, but always led to moments of discomfort. He asked about the history of the manor, about neighbouring lands, about strange lights that some peasants claimed to see in the forest on full moon nights. Lord Augustus answered with vague phrases, while Mrs. Matilda constantly tried to change the subject. Later that night, when everyone had retired, I found myself alone in the kitchen, cleaning the last utensils. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of wood and the distant howl of the wind. That's when I heard footsteps, light, calculated, approaching. I turned quickly, and there he was, the Duke, standing at the kitchen entrance. He no longer wore his formal coat, just a white shirt partially open at the chest, revealing the beginning of a scar that seemed to descend down his torso. I instinctively recoiled, looking for something to lean on. "Do not fear," he said, raising his hands in a pacifying gesture. "I did not come to harm you. What do you wish, Your Grace?" I asked, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "Can I prepare you something?" "Answers," he replied, approaching slowly. "I came seeking answers to questions I have waited years to ask." "I don't understand," I stammered, feeling my legs weaken. I am just a servant. No, he said with such certainty that it made me shiver. You are much more than that, Ilara. You feel it, don't you? That you don't belong in this place? That there is something different about you? I fell silent. How could he know? About the strange dreams that had tormented me since childhood? About the inexplicable sensations that invaded me when I touched certain plants or stones? About the instinct that allowed me to predict storms or find water even in the driest summers? He approached even closer until he was just a step away. Up close, his eyes weren't entirely black as they had seemed. They had nuances of dark green, like the forest at night. Do you carry something with you? He asked. Something that belonged to your parents? An amulet, perhaps? Or a medallion? My hand instinctively flew to my neck where, hidden beneath my simple dress, rested the only object I had inherited from my mother. An ancient silver medallion with strange symbols engraved on its surface. I never showed it to anyone. It was my secret, my only link to a past I didn't know. The Duke saw my gesture, and his eyes gleamed. May I see it? He asked, with a gentleness that contrasted with his usually authoritative posture. I hesitated, but something inside me, the same intuition that had always guided me, told me to trust him. Slowly I pulled the thin chain and revealed the medallion. He held his breath upon seeing it. His fingers rose, hesitant, as if to touch something sacred. May I? He asked again. I nodded in silence. When his fingers touched the medallion, I felt a current of warmth run through my body as if an invisible connection had been established. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I could see genuine emotion on his usually impenetrable face. As I imagined, he murmured, more to himself than to me. The symbol of the Order of the Crescent Moon. Your mother was a guardian, wasn't she? A guardian? I repeated, confused. My mother was a washerwoman. She worked for rich families in the village. He smiled, a sad smile that seemed to carry the weight of many secrets. That's what they made you believe, to protect you. Times were dangerous when you were born. The Inquisition still hunted the last members of the Order. I don't understand, I said, my head spinning with so much incomprehensible information. What Order? Why are you telling me this? Because I spent years searching for you, Ilara, he replied, his eyes fixed on mine. Since the last elder of the Order told me, on his deathbed, that a child had survived the massacre, a child with the purest blood, the last direct descendant of the High Priestess. I felt the air leave my lungs. That couldn't be true. I was just Ilara, the orphan raised out of charity, the girl without a surname or possessions. You're mistaken, I finally managed to say. I am nobody. You are everything, he replied with fervour. And that's why they fear you. That's why Mrs. Matilda treats you like a servant, even though she knows exactly who you are. Mrs. Matilda, I repeated, incredulous. She barely tolerates me. How could she know anything about me? Because it was she who betrayed the Order, he said, his eyes now hard as stone. It was she who revealed the priestess's hiding place to the Inquisition, her own sister. The floor seemed to collapse beneath my feet. My mother was Mrs. Matilda's sister. Half-sisters, daughters of the same father, different destinies. Lyra chose the Order. Matilda chose earthly power. And when Lyra, your mother, gave birth to a girl with the mark of the moon on her palm, Matilda saw the chance to eliminate the last threat to her dominance. I instinctively looked at my left hand, where a small crescent-shaped birthmark was hidden. I had always considered it a simple blemish, nothing more. How do you know all this? I asked, feeling hot tears stream down my face. Because I swore to your father with his last breath that I would find his daughter and protect her, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. He was my best friend, though our social positions were so different. Your father was not a simple blacksmith, Ilara. He was the guardian of the eternal flame. the last warrior of the Order. At that moment, something broke inside me. Memories, repressed for years. Flashes of a long-haired woman singing to me, of a strong man lifting me to the sky, of a night of screams and fire, surged forth with devastating force. I staggered and would have fallen if the Duke hadn't caught me. "I know it's a lot to absorb," he said, his voice now soft. "But we have no time. Matilda knows who I am and why I came. She must already be planning how to stop us." "Stop us?" I repeated, confused. "Stop what?" "The prophecy," he replied. "When the last daughter of the moon returns to the stone circle under the light of the eclipse, the veil between worlds will open again, and balance will be restored." Before I could ask more, we heard a creak on the floorboards. The Duke turned sharply, placing himself between me and the door. In the gloom, we saw Cecilia's silhouette, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. I came for water," she stammered. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop." The Duke relaxed slightly. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," she replied, stepping forward. In place of the timid, fragile girl from dinner, there was now a determined woman. Long enough to confirm what I always suspected, that Elara was not a simple orphan, that there was something special about her. "Cecilia," I began, not knowing what to say. We had never been close. The social difference had always been an insurmountable barrier, but there had never been hostility between us. "Don't worry," she said, approaching. "I won't betray you. In fact, I want to help." The Duke examined her with a critical gaze. "Why?" "Because I am also a prisoner here," she replied with bitterness in her voice. "A prisoner of expectations, of lies, of an arranged marriage that will save appearances but destroy my soul. And because—" she hesitated, looking at me, "because I always knew that Elara and I were connected in some way, ever since we were children." I then remembered the time Cecilia, when she was younger, tried to get close to me. How she brought me hidden books, how she defended me when Mrs. Matilda was particularly cruel. Over time, those small kindnesses diminished. Social pressures, I suppose. "The eclipse is in 3 days," the Duke said after a moment of reflection. "We need to reach the stone circle before then. It won't be easy. The roads are guarded, and Matilda will certainly suspect if we leave together." "I know a way," Cecilia said with sudden animation. "Through the forest. There's a secret passage that starts in the house's cellar and leads to the ancient temple. I found maps in my grandfather's journals." The Duke and I exchanged surprised glances. "Your grandfather?" I asked. "He wasn't like my father," Cecilia explained. "He respected the ancient traditions. He said that the earth had memory, that ancient spirits still walked among us. My father considered him mad. After he died, they destroyed almost all his belongings, but I saved some notebooks." "You are full of surprises, Cecilia of Thornwood," the Duke said with genuine respect in his voice. She smiled timidly. "Perhaps there is more to me than meets the eye, Your Grace." We agreed on a plan for the following night. Cecilia would show us the entrance to the secret passage. The Duke would pretend to leave in the morning, but would return disguised at dusk. I would prepare a small bundle with essentials for the journey. Everything seemed simple in theory. But when I returned to the servants' quarters that night, I found Margaret, the oldest of them, waiting for me with a stern look. "Where have you been?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Mrs. Matilda looked for you everywhere." My heart quickened. "In the kitchen," I replied, trying to sound calm, "finishing up the cleaning." "For almost 2 hours," she retorted, incredulous. "And why are you so flushed?" "It's hot in the kitchen," I replied, avoiding her gaze. Margaret had always been loyal to Mrs. Matilda. She made a point of reporting any irregularity, any slip-up by the other maids. That's why she held the position of housekeeper, even though she didn't have half the necessary competence. "The Duke asked about you today," she said, with malice in her voice. "He seemed very interested. Mrs. Matilda did not like that at all." I don't know what you're talking about, I replied, feigning disinterest as I arranged my thin mattress. Listen well, Ilara, she said, approaching until she was inches from my face. I know girls like you. You think you can charm a rich man and escape this life. But know that the Duke is not a man for games. They say his first wife mysteriously disappeared, and that the second died of a sudden fever that no doctor could explain. A chill ran down my spine. Could those stories be true? The Duke seemed sincere, seemed genuinely concerned for my well-being, but I barely knew him. What if all this was just an elaborate plan to what, exactly? I have no interest in the Duke, I said with all the firmness I could muster. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm exhausted. Margaret gave a venomous smile. Of course you are. Serving the elite must be tiring, especially when the service extends beyond the dinner table. Before I could answer, she walked away, leaving the insinuation hanging in the air like poison. I lay down, but sleep did not come. Thousands of thoughts swirled in my mind. What if all this was a trap? What if the Duke was lying? Why would he trust me so quickly? But then I remembered the medallion, the mark on my hand, the strange dreams I had always had. And more than anything, I remembered the feeling of belonging I felt when he spoke of the Order, as if something inside me finally made sense, as if I were for the first time close to understanding who I really was. The next morning, the Duke departed as planned. From the laundry window, I watched his black carriage drive away down the road, kicking up dust under the rising sun. Mrs. Matilda seemed relieved by his departure, but Lord Augustus was visibly disappointed. The chances of an advantageous marriage for Cecilia seemed to have vanished along with that carriage. He didn't even say a proper goodbye, I heard Mrs. Matilda tell her husband, as I passed down the corridor with a pile of clean sheets. He just said he had urgent business. No mention of a possible alliance, no praise for Cecilia. Honestly, Augustus, I think we should look for another solution to our problems. What other solution, woman? He replied, his voice tired. Our debts only increase. The banks are already threatening to foreclose on the mortgage. In less than a year, we could lose everything. Perhaps it's time to consider the other proposal, she said, lowering her voice. The one that came from the north. Never, Lord Augustus exclaimed with a vehemence that surprised me. That man is a monster, everyone knows that. I'd rather lose the manor than give my daughter to him. And what do you prefer? To see your daughter working as a servant when we lose everything? Or worse, on the streets without name or honor? Enough, Matilda, I said no. I moved away silently, but that conversation echoed in my mind. The family's situation was worse than I imagined, and that made our escape even riskier. If Cecilia disappeared right now, the day dragged on in an agony of waiting. Every noise startled me. Every glance from Mrs. Matilda seemed full of suspicion. During dinner, I served the family as always, but I noticed an unusual tension. Lord Augustus drank more than usual, while Mrs. Matilda barely touched her food. Cecilia kept her eyes down, responding only with monosyllables to occasional questions. After dinner, when everyone had retired, I went to the servants' quarters with my heart pounding. I waited for Margaret and the others to fall asleep before silently getting up. I put on a dark dress, the best I had, though it was still too simple. I tied my hair back firmly and placed the medallion over my clothes, letting it be visible for the first time. I descended the service stairs with extreme care, avoiding the steps I knew creaked. The house was plunged into darkness. Only the light of the full moon entered through the windows, creating elongated shadows in the corridors. When I reached the cellar, the air was heavy and damp. The smell of earth and mold invaded my nostrils. For a moment I was disoriented in the absolute darkness. Ilara, a soft voice called. It was Cecilia, emerging from the shadows with a small lantern. You came. I promised I would, I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. The Duke hasn't arrived yet, she said, leading me to the back of the cellar where large wine barrels lined the wall. He said he might be late. The roads are being watched. Watched? By whom? Men of the Inquisition, a grave voice replied behind us. We turned, startled, only to find the Duke emerging from a dark recess of the cellar. He was simply dressed, like a common merchant, without any of the insignia of his position. They arrived in the village this afternoon, asking about strangers, about ancient traditions, about the stone circle. How did you get in? Cecilia asked. I have my methods, he replied with a slight smile. Now we need to hurry. The passage is long, and we have to reach the circle before dawn. Cecilia nodded and moved one of the barrels, revealing a small door in the wall. It looked ancient, made of solid wood with iron reinforcements already corroded by rust. My grandfather wrote about this passage, she explained, as the Duke helped open the heavy door. Legend says it was built by the first inhabitants of this land, long before the early European explorers arrived. It was a sacred path that led from the world of men to the world of spirits. And it leads directly to the stone circle? I asked, feeling a shiver run down my spine. Not exactly, she replied. It ends in a cave at the foot of the mountain. From there we'll have to climb the rest of the way to the top, where the circle is. The door finally gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into the darkness. The air that came out of it was cold and carried a strange odour. Not unpleasant, but ancient, like the interior of an abandoned church. I'll go first, the Duke said, taking the lantern from Cecilia's hands. You follow me. Don't touch the walls if you can help it. There are symbols engraved on them that still hold power. And keep silent. Sound attracts things in these ancient tunnels. I swallowed hard but nodded. Cecilia squeezed my hand briefly, a silent gesture of support before we followed the Duke into the tunnel. The first few yards were the most difficult. The ceiling was low, forcing us to walk bent over. The floor was uneven, with loose stones that threatened to make us stumble with every step. But soon the tunnel widened, revealing a broad passage, with a ceiling high enough for us to walk upright. In the flickering light of the lantern, I could see that Cecilia was right. The walls were covered with strange symbols, some similar to those on my medallion. Spirals, circles, figures that seemed half human, half animal. And at regular intervals the same image was repeated, a crescent moon above what appeared to be a mountain. We walked for hours, or at least it seemed so. The tunnel sometimes narrowed, sometimes widened, occasionally branched off. In those moments the Duke always stopped, carefully examining the paths before choosing a direction. How do you know where to go? I whispered during one of these stops. I'm following the Order's marks, he replied, pointing to small, almost imperceptible crescent moons carved into the floor. And I can feel it somehow. The energy of the circle. It pulses stronger as we approach, we continued in silence. The air grew colder and damper. Occasionally, we heard distant sounds. Something like running water, or perhaps the whisper of the wind. But other times, they were more unsettling sounds. Scraping, scratching, or what sounded like a prolonged sigh. What was that? Cecilia asked after one of those noises, gripping my arm tightly. Nothing we should worry about, the Duke replied, though his tone didn't inspire much confidence. The ancients built these tunnels not only as passages, but as barriers. There are guardians who prevent certain beings from passing from one side to the other. What kind of beings? I asked, regretting the question before I even finished it. The Duke looked at me seriously. Those who live in the spaces between worlds. Those who feed on dreams and memories. Those that the Order of the Moon kept imprisoned for millennia. And these guardians, are they trustworthy? Cecilia asked, her voice trembling slightly. They used to be, he replied. But after the Order's massacre, many lost their purpose. Some went mad. Others simply changed sides. We followed in silence after that, each absorbed in our own thoughts and fears. The passage began to incline upward and the air grew fresher. Small drops of water trickled down the walls, reflecting the lantern light like silver tears. It was then that we heard it, a distinct sound of footsteps, many footsteps, echoing behind us in the tunnel. Quick, the Duke whispered, extinguishing the lantern, against the wall. Don't move. We obeyed immediately, pressing our backs against the cold stone of the wall. In the sudden darkness, my other senses sharpened. I could hear Cecilia's accelerated breathing beside me, smell the damp earth, and more than anything, perceive those approaching footsteps, metallic, rhythmic, relentless. A faint light began to insinuate itself through the tunnel. It was not the warm, yellowish light of lanterns or torches. It was a bluish light, cold as ice, that seemed to suck the warmth from the surrounding air. "Don't look directly at them," the Duke murmured, so low I almost didn't hear him. "No matter what you see or hear. Don't look!" The footsteps drew even closer. The blue light grew more intense. And then I saw them. Or rather, glimpsed them out of the corner of my eye. Tall figures, taller than any man, covered in black cloaks that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. Their faces, if they had any, were hidden beneath deep hoods. In their hands, they carried what looked like lanterns made of bluish glass, from which that spectral light emanated. There were 3. They walked in single file, slowly and deliberately, as if patrolling the tunnel. When they passed us, I felt a wave of cold so intense that I thought I would freeze right there. My teeth began to chatter and I had to bite my lip hard to keep from making a sound. One of them stopped suddenly. It turned its hooded head slowly in our direction. For a terrible moment, I thought it had seen us. But then it continued on its way, following the other 2 who were already moving away. We waited in silence, motionless, until the sound of footsteps completely disappeared and the blue light was just a distant memory. Only then did the Duke light the lantern again. "What were those things?" Cecilia asked, her voice still trembling. "The Walkers," he replied, his face grim. "Ancient guardians who became corrupted. Now they serve those who seek to impede the prophecy." "The Inquisition?" I asked. "Not exactly," he said, starting to walk again, now at a faster pace. "The Inquisition is just a tool, a facade. Behind it are forces much older and much more dangerous. Forces that fear the balance that the Order of the Moon maintained." "What? Forces?" I insisted. He hesitated before answering. "There are many names for them. The Order called them Light Devourers. The ancient peoples of this land knew them as the Faceless Ones. In more recent texts, they are simply called the Others." "And what do they want?" Cecilia asked. "What they've always wanted," he replied. "To fully cross into our world. To break the barriers between realities. And for that, they need to prevent the stone circle from being reactivated." We continued walking, now in absolute silence. The tunnel began to widen even more, and soon we entered a spacious chamber supported by thick columns carved from the rock itself. In the center, a circular pool was filled with crystal-clear water that reflected the lantern light like a perfect mirror. "The pool of reflections," the Duke said, with reverence in his voice. "We are almost at the exit." We approached the pool. The water was completely still, without the slightest ripple, reflecting our faces with incredible perfection. But then, as I watched, my reflection began to change. It was no longer I, Alara the servant, who looked back at me. It was a woman with long, dark hair, with ritual symbols painted on her face, wearing clothes that seemed made of liquid light. Her eyes, my eyes somehow, gleamed with ancient power. I recoiled in alarm. I looked at Cecilia and saw that she too was staring at her reflection in astonishment. In the watery mirror, she appeared with a crown of wildflowers, a green cloak like the forest, and in her hands, a silver key that shimmered with its own light. "Do not fear," the Duke said, his voice strangely distant. "The pool shows not what we are, but what we are meant to become." I looked at his reflection and saw no longer the noble, authoritative Duke, but a warrior covered in scars, with a flaming sword in one hand and a shield with the crescent moon symbol in the other. His eyes in the reflection were completely black, without iris or pupil. Eyes of someone who had seen beyond the veil between worlds. "Come," he said, moving away from the pool. "We are near the exit, but we still have to climb the mountain before dawn." We followed a corridor that led out of the chamber, climbing higher and higher. The air gradually became fresher and cleaner. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, we saw a pale light ahead. Not the artificial light of lanterns, but the natural light of the moon. We emerged into a small cave opening on the mountainside. The night sky stretched above us, sprinkled with stars, and the moon, almost full, bathed the landscape with its silver light. Ahead of us, a narrow path climbed the slope, winding between rocks and trees twisted by the wind. "Behold our path," the Duke said, pointing to the mountaintop, where a cluster of dark shapes stood out against the sky. The stone circle. We still have a few hours until dawn. We began to climb. The path was steep and treacherous, with loose stones that rolled under our feet. Cecilia, despite her determination, was clearly not accustomed to such physical exertion. Her delicate hands were soon scratched by the rocks, and her breathing became ragged. "Can we stop for a moment?" she finally asked, leaning against a tree. "Just to catch our breath." The Duke looked anxiously at the sky. "We don't have much time, but yes, a brief rest." We sat on some stones, trying to regain our strength. From our position, we could see the vastness of the forest below, stretching to the horizon. Somewhere there, hidden among hills, was Thornwood Manor, the place I had called home for so many years, though it had never truly been mine. "What will happen when we reach the circle?" I asked the Duke, who was observing the sky with a concentrated expression. "If the prophecy is correct," he replied, "you, as the last descendant of the priestess, will be able to reactivate the portal between worlds. This will restore the balance that was broken when the Order was destroyed. The others will again be contained behind the veil, and the Earth will begin to heal." "And how will I do that?" I asked, feeling the weight of responsibility fall upon my shoulders. "The medallion," he said, pointing to the object hanging from my neck. "It is the key. When positioned on the central altar under the light of the eclipse, it will open the way." "Eclipse?" Cecilia repeated, surprised. "I thought we only needed the full moon." The Duke smiled slightly. Observant, as always. "Yes, Cecilia. The eclipse will occur this morning, shortly after dawn. It is a rare event, happening only once every century. It is when the moon's powers are most concentrated, most accessible." "And what is my role in all this?" she asked, gazing at him intently. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You are the guardian of the portal. When Ilara opens the way, you must keep it stable. Your blood, a mixture of earth and sky, is the necessary balance." "And you?" I asked. "What is your role?" His face grew grim. "I am the protector. My function is to ensure that you both reach the circle and complete the ritual. No matter the cost." There was something in his voice, a note of resignation and determination that made me uncomfortable. But before I could question further, he stood up abruptly. "We are being followed," he said, his body tense like an animal about to strike. "Quick, we must continue." I looked back and for an instant thought I saw bluish lights moving among the trees below, but perhaps it was just my imagination, stimulated by fear. We resumed our climb with renewed urgency. The path grew steeper and more dangerous. At some points we had to cling to exposed roots or rocky ledges to avoid falling. Our hands and knees were soon chafed and sore, but we continued. Finally, as the sky began to lighten slightly to the east, we reached a plateau at the top of the mountain. And there, majestic and ancient, was the stone circle. There were 12 megaliths arranged in a perfect circle, each at least 10 feet tall. In the center, a flat stone served as an altar. All were covered with symbols similar to those in the tunnel and on my medallion. But the most impressive thing was the sensation that emanated from the place. An ancient, almost palpable power that made the air subtly vibrate. "It's incredible," Cecilia murmured, her eyes wide. "I can feel as if the earth is breathing." "The veil is thinner here," the Duke explained, advancing reverently to the center of the circle. "The ancients chose this location well. It is a point where the energies of the earth meet those of the sky." We followed him to the central altar. Seen up close, I noticed it had a small circular cavity in its center, exactly the size of my medallion. "The sun will rise soon," the Duke said, looking at the increasingly bright horizon. "And with it, the eclipse will begin. We need to prepare." He took a small glass vial containing a dark red liquid from his pouch. "The blood of the last guardian," he explained, seeing my questioning gaze. "Your father gave it to me before he died, knowing this day would come." Carefully, he poured a few drops of the liquid into the altar's cavity. Then he took a dagger from his belt, a curved blade with the same crescent moon symbol engraved on the hilt. "Ilara," he said, handing me the dagger. "I need you to give 3 drops of your blood, blood of the priestess, blood of the moon." I hesitated for a moment, but then, taking a deep breath, I took the dagger. Carefully, I made a small cut on the palm of my hand, exactly over the crescent-shaped birthmark. Blood welled up bright red and I let 3 drops fall onto the altar. "Now you, Cecilia," the Duke said, handing her the dagger. She repeated the gesture, cutting her palm and letting 3 drops of blood fall beside mine. "And now?" I asked, feeling a strange energy begin to pulse around us. "Now," the Duke said, taking my medallion with reverence, "we complete the circle." He placed the medallion in the altar's cavity, where it fit perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the symbols engraved on the stones around us began to glow with a pale blue light. Not the cold blue of the walkers, but a warm, comforting blue like the sky on a summer day. "It's working," Cecilia whispered, amazed. The light intensified, and the air around us began to vibrate more strongly. I felt a tingling sensation run through my entire body, as if every cell responded to that ancient energy. And then, looking at the horizon, I saw the first rays of the sun, and with them, the moon's shadow beginning to cover it. "The eclipse," the Duke said, his face illuminated by the supernatural glow of the stones. "It's beginning." But the same instant he said that, we heard a sound that chilled my blood, the metallic sound of approaching footsteps, many of them, climbing the trail we had just traversed. "The walkers," Cecilia said, her face pale with terror. "They've caught up to us." The Duke drew his sword, a long, elegant blade that gleamed with the same blue light as the stones. "Stay in the circle," he commanded, his voice now filled with authority. "No matter what happens, do not leave. The ritual must be completed." He moved to the edge of the plateau, positioning himself between us and the path. Soon the first hooded figures appeared, their blue lanterns cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. There were not just 3 now, there were at least 12, advancing in an orderly formation, and behind them, to my absolute horror, I saw a familiar face, Mrs. Matilda, dressed in black, her eyes gleaming with hatred and triumph. "Matilda," I whispered, incredulous. "She is one of them," Cecilia said, gripping my hand. "Always has been. A servant of the others, disguised among humans." The Duke positioned himself firmly, sword in hand. "Go back to the shadows from whence you came," he shouted, his voice echoing through the stones. "This circle does not belong to you." Mrs. Matilda took a step forward, and for the first time, I saw her face contort into a cruel smile that did not seem human. "Henry of Stonehaven," she said, with a voice that seemed to contain multiple overlapping voices. "Last of the protectors. Do you truly think you can stop us? We are many, and you are alone." "He is not alone," a new voice said, and to our absolute astonishment, we saw Lord Augustus emerge from among the trees on the other side of the plateau. He was not alone. Dozens of men accompanied him, armed with swords, bows, and torches. "Father," Cecilia called, incredulous. Lord Augustus advanced, his eyes briefly meeting hers before fixing on Mrs. Matilda. "I knew," he said, his voice laden with sadness and determination. "I always knew what you truly were. I just never had the strength to confront you." "Fool!" Mrs. Matilda hissed, her face now distorted by rage. "You never understood the power you could have had. What they offer surpasses anything this world can give." "They offer only illusion and death," he replied, drawing his own sword. "And today this ends." What followed was chaos. The walkers advanced, their ethereal forms gliding over the rocky terrain with supernatural speed. The Duke launched himself against them, his sword slicing the air in arcs of blue light. Lord Augustus's men joined the battle, their conventional weapons seeming to do little against those beings, but their numbers compensated. Inside the stone circle, Cecilia and I watched in horror. The light emanating from the stones grew increasingly intense, and the medallion on the altar began to spin on its own. "Faster and faster!" "The eclipse is almost complete," Cecilia said, looking at the sky where the sun was almost entirely covered by the moon's shadow. "We need to finish the ritual." But what was the ritual? The Duke hadn't explained that part. I looked around desperately, searching for a clue, a sign. It was then that I noticed something on the altar. Words engraved in the stone, previously invisible, now glowing with their own light. "Blood of the moon, blood of the earth." I read aloud, "United by the Protector's sacrifice, they shall open the way and restore balance." Protector's sacrifice. The words echoed in my mind, and I suddenly understood the resignation I had seen on the Duke's face. He knew, I murmured, looking at the battle where he fought fiercely against 3 walkers simultaneously. He always knew he would have to die for the ritual to be completed. No, Cecilia exclaimed, squeezing my hand tightly. There must be another way. At that moment, a cry cut through the air. The Duke had been hit, a spectral blade piercing his shoulder. He staggered but continued fighting. Lord Augustus and his men were surrounded, fighting desperately against the walkers, who seemed invulnerable to their weapons. And Mrs. Matilda advanced slowly towards us, her body now emitting the same cold blue light as the walkers, her feet barely touching the ground. We have to do something, Cecilia said, tears streaming down her face. It was then that I felt, or rather heard, something within me. A voice not of words, but of sensations and images. And with it came knowledge. I knew with absolute certainty what needed to be done. Give me your hand, I said to Cecilia, extending my cut palm. The blood of the moon and the blood of the earth united. She understood immediately, placing her wounded hand over mine. Our blood mixed, and an intense warmth coursed through my body. The light emanating from the stones around us became almost blinding. We need the protector, I said, looking at the Duke, who was still fighting, now visibly weakened, but not his sacrifice, only his renewed oath. I raised my voice, feeling a power I never knew I possessed flow through the words. Henry of Stonehaven, by your oath to the Order of the Moon, I summon you to the circle. My voice echoed with supernatural force, making even the walkers hesitate. The Duke looked in our direction, his eyes meeting mine through the chaos of battle. He nodded almost imperceptibly and, gathering his last strength, cleared a path to us, his sword cutting through anything that stood in his way. When he finally crossed the line of stones into the circle, the blue light formed an impenetrable barrier, stopping the walkers who tried to follow him. The eclipse is at its peak, Cecilia cried, pointing to the sky where the sun had completely disappeared behind the moon, forming a ring of fire. Now, the Duke knelt before the altar, placing his bloodied hand over ours. I renew my oath, he said, his voice weak but resolute. As protector, as guardian, as servant of the Order of the Moon. My life, my blood, my soul, all for the restoration of balance. I felt the power flow through all 3 of us. Like an electric current, the medallion on the altar spun so fast it was just a golden blur. The light from the stones intensified until everything around us disappeared in a sea of brilliant blue. And then, it happened. In the center of the circle, the air began to open. There was no other way to describe it. It was as if reality itself was tearing apart, revealing behind it a space that was neither darkness nor light, but something beyond human comprehension. On the other side, I saw, or felt, for there was no actual sight involved, presences. Ancient, wise, powerful. The true guardians of the veil between worlds, those whom the Order of the Moon had served for millennia. A sense of recognition emanated from them when they perceived me, and with it, an instantaneous transfer of knowledge, stories, rituals, secrets that had been lost when the Order was destroyed. They are returning, I murmured, feeling tears stream down my face. The true guardians are returning. A powerful wind began to blow from the portal, dragging everything in its direction. The walkers screamed, a horrifying sound, like metal being twisted, as they were inexorably sucked into the opening. Mrs. Matilda fought desperately against the force, clinging to stones, to trees, to anything that could prevent her fate. "No!" she screamed, her voice distorted. "We served them faithfully. They promised us eternal power." "The others lie," the Duke said, watching her with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "They always lied. They use and discard their servants like broken tools." For a moment, Mrs. Matilda's face regained something of humanity. Fear, regret, belated understanding. Then she was swallowed into the portal along with the last of the walkers. Slowly, the wind subsided. The portal began to close, not completely, but reducing to a thin, brilliant blue line that pulsed in the center of the circle. The eclipse was ending, the moon moving to reveal the sun once more. "It is done," the Duke said, exhausted but triumphant. "The portal is stabilized. The Guardians have returned to their post. The others are again contained behind the veil. And now? Cecilia asked, looking at her father who was slowly approaching, wounded but alive. Now, the Duke replied, the true work begins. The rebuilding of the Order of the Moon, the relearning of ancient knowledge, the healing of the Earth wounded by centuries of imbalance. He turned to me, his eyes now filled with respect and something more. Hope. And you, Alara, last descendant of the priestess, will be our guide. Our new high priestess. I looked at my hands, the same hands that for years had scrubbed floors, washed clothes, served people who considered me inferior. Hands of a servant that now held the fate of worlds. I don't know if I'm ready, I confessed. No one ever is, he replied with a tired smile. But you will not be alone. Cecilia took my hand, her eyes shining with determination. We will be in this together as we promised under the fig tree. Sisters, not by blood, but by soul. Lord Augustus approached, bowing respectfully. My house and my lands are at your service, High Priestess. It is the least I can offer after years of injustice. I looked around, at the circle of ancient stones, at the portal that pulsed softly in the center, at the people who now looked at me with respect and expectation. And for the first time in my life, I felt that I had finally found my true home, my true purpose. The sun shone fully now, bathing the circle in golden light. A new day, a new beginning. For me, for the order, for the balance between worlds. I raised my face to the sky and let the warmth of the sun envelop me, while within me, ancient knowledge began to awaken. It would not be easy. There would be challenges, dangers, sacrifices. But now I knew who I was. And more importantly, I knew what I needed to do. I am ready, I finally said, my voice firm and clear, to serve the order, the earth, and the balance between all worlds. And so, on that mountaintop, under the clear morning sky after the eclipse, a new chapter began, and not just of my story, but of the story of all the worlds that touch in the thin veil between realities. A chapter of restoration of balance, of hope. And the silver medallion that had been my mother's, now once again around my neck, shone with its own light, no longer a symbol of a lost past, but of a future to be built.